if you were here last Sunday and did the 120,000 feet overview of Christianity and the Reformation, this is maybe a 20,000 foot view of the colonies and the Anglican and then the Episcopal Church in what, of course, becomes the United States. I found it really, actually, ironically, much harder to condense / overview this piece of history than the Reformation. And I don't know what that says about me or the subject matter, but it's kind of interesting. So as colonial powers are established across the world, and England, of course, Spain, France, and other nationalities are sending people out to establish colonies, of course, they take their churches with them. So many of the settlers of what becomes the United States are British or English, depends on how you want to define that nationality. And the first of those are sent out when Elizabeth I is in power. The most famous explorer is, of course, Walter Raleigh, and we all know about the lost colony of Roanoke. What most of us don't know is that's not the first place that Raleigh landed. The first place was actually on the other side, outside of San Francisco, what is now San Francisco Bay? Yes, San Francisco Bay. So Drake's first ship landing and the first service with the Book of Common Prayer was in waters off the shores of California, which is kind of crazy for us to think about. Obviously, it became much clearer for folks on the British Isles that it was a lot easier to get to the eastern seaboard than the western, which is why all of the initial colonies end up being, well, not California. The first baptisms are a part of the Roanoke colony. Virginia Dare is the first baptism, followed by a native whose name I have lost and is not in my notes suddenly. Anyway, so the Virginia colony is literally a royalist project by Elizabeth. So the established churches of Virginia get settled, of course, Roanoke doesn't found, but then is later founded in Jamestown, is still based around the Anglican Church. So the Book of Common Prayer under Elizabeth, which is the 1559 Book of Common Prayer, is the first use here in what will become America, or the United States. And of course, Virginia is named for Elizabeth, who was the Virgin Queen. Those who charter colonies with Britain or others tend to be in kind of one of two groups. They are either part of the establishment, in other words, they are like Raleigh working for the crown, so they're going to be establishing crown-based or royalist colonies. And then you have the folks who are less into their centralized modes of religion and want Reformation to go further, that they don't think that the Church of England was reformed enough. And of course, part of that is the Puritan Party. Whether or not, once they get here, they start to practice completely independently or not, looks a little bit different in each dependent colony. And this is where we get really lost in the weeds. We could talk about the character of the churches in different colonies for forever. And I'm gonna not do that. If that's super interesting to you and you're really lit up about that, I will be happy to point you to some other resources, because while I love seeing your smiling faces, I do not intend to keep you here all day. The church, in however it is established in various colonies, when it comes to about 1640, is left to its own devices because England falls into civil war. If you were here for last session, we talked a little bit about this. The monarchy is overthrown, and for about 12 years, England lives under a commonwealth as opposed to a monarchical society. And while they are dealing with the ins and outs of that, whatever has been established in the colonies is kind of left to figure it out on their own. So there's no direct oversight because things at home are far too focused on first the Civil War and then what life is going to look like in this new regime and way of living. Ironically, the Bishop of London is the one who oversees the colonies. And that obviously is not very convenient to oversee clergy when you are an ocean apart. So a governor, a royal governor was appointed by the king after the Commonwealth to oversee church practices. And that's kind of weird for us to think, but it was literally a government appointed authority who was going to monitor clergy and make sure they were using the Book of Common Prayer correctly, as well as issue marriage licenses and the other pieces that come a part of the church, record baptisms, all those kinds of things. In 1636, the Vestry System is developed as a way to help manage church properties and also manage, on a local level, calling clergy. The name vestry comes from the fact that this group, who were originally 12 men who were landowners, they met in the vesting room, so they became the vestry. We still have the evolution of the vestry system today. That's how we take care of our church property, how we make sure that when you are between clergy, a new clergy person is selected and found, even though they typically appoint another committee to actually do that work. So in this period, there are a huge number of challenges that face the established church, particularly the Church of England. As a colony, the first thing, of course, and first foremost, we already touched on that, is the bishop. The bishop is in London. So you can't ordain clergy here. You have to take that perilous sea journey that takes weeks sometimes, depending on the winds and currents, all the way to England to ordain your clergy members, which means, generally speaking, you have a large shortage of clergy. You also have the issue of clergy education. In the early days of the colonies, there aren't large centers of higher learning. It's a lower priority next to things like actually building cities and roads and getting things established. As soon as those things start to developing, there's a little bit more of at least raising up local clergy members, because the other option, of course, is to recruit people to emigrate or to go to the colonies to serve in churches. Not a real easy sell for most people, particularly in the 1600s. In 1689, a commissary is appointed to help address this clergy issue, and the oversight try and help train and develop new ministers, as well as make sure that the ones who are in practice are doing the things they need to do. But that doesn't take care of the issue of the bishop, at least in terms of the structure of the Anglican Church. During this period, there are several missionary societies that are founded out of England who go to the various colonies to basically help educate lay people. Because the other problem is when you don't have a lot of clergy, religious education tends to go by the wayside. So the flavor and character of individual churches, which is already sort of established in different colonies, is further influenced by which missionary societies educate and form people, generally speaking. So for instance, the church in Virginia ends up being incredibly what we call low church, or not a lot of trappings. It's very lay-centric, not a lot of pomp and circumstance, and that tradition continues on, but that's largely based on the missionary society that was in Virginia educating people. What that looked in some of the northern colonies was entirely different. So the church mucks back and forth for the next several years as the colonies trying to figure out what they are going to become, and of course eventually we get up to the Revolutionary War. Just prior to things really starting to get into move, because of the bishop problem, the Bishop of London, who is newly seated in 1748, refuses oversight of the colonies because he recognizes that's not legitimate oversight, as also to put pressure on the national or the established Anglican Church to come up with a solution to the fact that the Americas don't have a bishop. This leads to both colonial and English huge debate over what the answer should be and whether the colonies should have their own bishop. And generally speaking, Parliament does not think that should be the case. And on the colonial end of it, there are a lot of people who are very hesitant to have bishops present in the colonies, because in the Church of England, it's not just an ecclesiastical authority. Bishops are also civil servants. And by this point, there are a lot of colonial folks who don't want more royal and or English government. They are ready for their own. And having bishops here is contrary to that. So that really doesn't come to any kind of a resolution prior to the Revolution. As part of a way to solve the way of living day-to-day parish and church life, clergy in the colonies began calling conventions to survive through these arguments, as well as come to some agreement about how we're going to govern ourselves as a church body, how we can communicate back and forth as clergy so we're not isolated, like all of the things we can think about, like what our national convention as the Episcopal Church does. So to have a form of touch-based communication, government, and policy. This becomes something that, yeah. No, not yet. Not yet. Not until post-Revolutionary War. I'm hoping I can find that really. I couldn't find it when I was working on these. It is used first at a convention, and the date isn't right in my order that I would like it to be. Part of that conversation, particularly as we go into the Revolutionary War, comes into two main camps as to what the church that will become the Church of the United States is going to look like. The first is, of course, keeping the power, structure, and authority that has existed in the Church of England, which is bishops and top down. The church is basically governed by church people. So once someone is ordained, they basically end up with a role in church government. That's traditional church leadership model. And the other is something completely different than that, which is basically throwing bishops out. And there's big tension in what it was the Anglican Church, for lack of a better descriptor, of what that going forward ought to be. The other complicating factor going into the Revolutionary War is most Anglican clergy are royalists. In other words, they support the crown. There's a lot of reasons for this, but part of that is to become an ordained person in the Church of England, you have to take a vow to support the monarchy. It's also the head of the English church, right? So it isn't just your sovereign, it is also, it's not a one-to-one, but Pope, for lack of a better corollary in the Church of England. As a clergy person, you are doubly vowed to follow your monarch and the sovereign ruler of the church. Causes a lot of tension during the Revolutionary War itself, and then even more so in the days following, because clergy were royalists. So what do we do with you now that we are no longer an English colony, but an independent nation? One of the first things that comes out of this is what Camille has already asked, and it is disassociation with the word Anglican, also understanding we need a different identity. A lot of folks in the former Anglican Church want what will become the Episcopal Church to become a national church. But how do you do that when you already have established that you want religious liberty and to be free of the persecutions that have happened on either sides as the Reformation happened? So we have to come up with another name. And leaning onto that line of bishops and the thing that we are going to end up hanging on to, the Episcopal word is coined and becomes eventually the name of the church. And I've lost the evolution of that. I may at the end see if I can find where that falls. But that's how it, yeah.
And isn't it true that after the Declaration of Independence that George ordered all the folks that were confirmed rebels to be excommunicated?
Maybe. It's entirely possible. Whether that in practice meant anything here is another story, because royal edicts and being lived out in a colony is a different thing. That doesn't mean a priest is going to discommunicate all its members, right? Even if you're still a royalist, you may not excommunicate your entire church.
Yeah. Well, there were plenty of loyalists here.
Right, but what? Yes, yes.
Were, dedicated to the crown.
Sure,
But if somebody was a rebel and fighting for freedom, he was supposed to say, "You're out."
Right, exactly.
That's the way I understood it.
My understanding is we became Episcopal when we got a bishop.
So the name generates around that because that's how we end up going into a model of leadership, which is what we're getting into next. So out of that convention system comes the debate of how are we going to indeed govern ourselves. And that 2-point model system comes into contention about, well, if we're going to go with a bishop model, we have to have a bishop. And the first person, there were some conversations about it, but the first person who was eventually made a bishop is Samuel Seabury. Samuel Seabury was elected by his convention, which was the Diocese of Connecticut, and he goes to England in hopes of being consecrated as the state's first bishop. Not to be a detractor of Samuel Seabury, but the support of Connecticut's clergy is 10 people. It's 10 people. That 10 people vote for Seabury to be bishop. He gets there, there's a big debate. His process, which you'd hope would take a couple of months, continues to draw out. And the English bishops dither, and ultimately Parliament says, no, I can't ordain you because you're not going to take the oath of loyalty to the crown. And we aren't willing to omit this from the ordination vows of a bishop. So Seabury goes to Scotland. The National Church of Scotland is the Presbyterian Church, and the Anglican Church of Scotland is sort of the secondary, and for a long time was an underground denomination that basically functioned independently because it wasn't the national church. So there are a bunch of bishops called the non-juring bishops who agree to ordain Seabury in exchange for several agreements. The first of which is that the church in the United States will use the Scottish Book of Common Prayer rather than the English Book of Common Prayer. Part of the agreement is also to say keep lay people out of church governance, keep it into the bishop's structure, which of course doesn't happen. Whether Seabury had the authority to agree to that or not, that isn't what shook out. 2 years later, ironically, British Parliament was in a very different place and allows for 2 subsequent consecrations of the next 2 bishops, William White and Samuel Provost, who end up becoming the counter voices to Seabury. So Seabury still argues for the traditional bishop top-down role of governance, and particularly William White is like, no, we need to do something congregational and laity-based. In a huge convention in 1789, they make a compromise between these 2 camps, and basically that becomes the model and the bones for the church structure that still runs the Episcopal Church today, and that is that the House of Bishops, clergy, and a House of Laity who are elected, very similar to the Vestry System, are the 3 bodies that govern the church, and each of them has a separate voice. So everybody has a voice. It isn't identical to the colonial government structure and how we end up building Congress and House of Representatives, but it's similar because it is based on leadership by representation. Yeah. Seabury. There's William White, who's probably the other large one, and Samuel Provost. They also ratify the first American Book of Common Prayer, which again is a compromise. It is not a straight ticket from the Scottish prayer book, nor is it the 1662 English Book of Common Prayer. It's a blend of the 2. One of the things that is predominantly Scottish, which I think is interesting, is the word priest. That isn't what appears in the 1662. There's also a part of the liturgy which is interesting that is unique for our prayer book tradition, and that's the epiclesis. It's the part of the Eucharist where, and we still include it in the liturgy today, where we ask the Spirit to come on the gifts, and depending on the prayer, depends on what that sound like, but it's literally the part where we say, come and make this the sacrament that it is. That does not exist in the 1662 Book of Common Prayer or other editions of the English prayer book. We have had it because of the Scottish tradition throughout our prayer book revision history. The newer liturgies of the Church of England do include it, as does the Roman Missal, and et cetera, as a part of revised liturgy and liturgical renewal. We can talk about that a lot more when we get to the prayer book. The other thing that's kind of fun is that there was a clause that allowed you to change the line from the Apostles' Creed about Jesus descending into hell. And there were a couple of options about what you could say instead, which are not what we say now. And I've never actually seen an edition or a facsimile of the first prayer book. I would actually really like to see how that was printed. So obviously one of the biggest changes is that for the church is that bishops are no longer civil authorities. They're just ecclesiastical ones. The other thing that comes about that has to be figured out is that as part of the Church of England, you are partially subsidized by taxation because you're a branch of the government. Well, if you're no longer a government institution and you're going to separate church and government, how do you replace that lost income? How do you pay your clergy if you no longer have a tax base? And this becomes an issue for all denominations in the United States, right? You have to figure out how to now self-fund, whereas before you might have bequests or donations to the poor or other supplementary things. You paid your priest and you kept your doors open by that money from taxation. So that becomes a struggle for everybody to figure out of how to ask people to tithe and do it in such a way that you can actually have educated clergy. In the probably first 100 years of the Episcopal Church, probably 90% of the clergy are bivocational, and most of them serve more than one congregation. There's just no way for them to make a living serving a single congregation, unless it's a very large and wealthy congregation that can pay for a clergy person and sustain someone's lifestyle. So that's an interesting evolution as you get into the 1800s and churches become institutionalized and are able to take care of their own clergy people. It's an interesting evolution overall. I'm trying to decide how much more I want to talk about that because we can talk about that forever. I think I'm going to stop there for this morning. Are there other questions? We are going to do a separate session that is literally just on the structure of the Episcopal Church because it's if you aren't familiar with it, it's weird. Yeah.
Why would yes, what I took it out, but why would the church say that Jesus descended into hell? That makes no sense.
So the idea in the creed, in the original version of the creed, is that between Jesus' death and resurrection, that Jesus takes salvation to the dead. And the theology originally was that anybody who had lived before Jesus would have been in hell. So you can understand why that became the non-popular version of the creed. That's why it's still, like, that version is still in our prayer book, but we don't use that, right? Like, we say now, descended to the dead. So part of that arc of medieval history about what hell is and what salvation is, and the Protestant Reformed view is it's maybe not that cut and dry. We're still into hell, but not in the same assurity. Let's put it that way. What else you got, friends?
Except the vestry originated here. What did they have there to do the mundane things to take care of the church?
So there's a little bit different. There is a village system that's kind of a parish council that is both, for lack of a better word, a city council that also oversees church pieces. That sort of still functions today. It isn't quite a one-to-one, but the parish council still exists, and that's how those things are oversighted. Also, the church had sextons and people who were specifically jobbed and tasked with taking care of a church in addition to clergy. So it looks a little bit different. It still does because, again, it's a state institution. Wouldn't that be nice? Terrible, but nice.
Separation of church and state still.
So there is and there isn't. It's a weird. So the church is no longer mandated, right? Like there was a point in British history where basically you had to go to church. You were mandated by law to attend Church of England worship so many times a year. And even as other faith traditions rose in England, that was still a thing, and you could get in trouble if you didn't show up at least occasionally in the actual formal sanctioned church. By the 1800s, you get to a point where you can participate in worship in other denominations, but if you want to do the official sacraments like baptism and marriage, that has to happen within the Church of England. So you can go be Presbyterian or Methodist or whatever else, but to be officially married, you have to go to a C of E church to do it. That changes in the late 1800s, and so there's the religious liberty, and there is a separation between church and state because church no longer has the governing factor over day-to-day life.
But your taxes still support.
Yeah, right, it's still an institution. Yes. It's not as one-to-one as England. It's complicated.
But it happened in the colonies. Everybody had to pay taxes to the church.
Right, initially everybody did, right? Like especially in the colonial days, that's how you supported all of the institutions. It was part of the argument over taxation without representation.
Especially women and orphans.
Yes. And also, it helps us to put it in context like that. We kind of knee-jerk against that. But originally, religious institutions were social services. That was the only way that there was any kind of ministry to people who couldn't work or who were widows or orphans. All those things. It was literally coming out of the church institution. And that's part of why it's not it's not truly just social services, but that's part of why there's still funding there.
Which is why it's ridiculous when people complain about establishment of religion, and they're complaining about somebody on their own praying in school, as if that has something to do with separation of church and state, because it's got nothing to do
The
with
problem is that there's not one way to pray, and a lot of people want to pray in one way, and that's where that becomes an issue, right? Like,
Yeah, if somebody's doing it on their own, in private, on their own time,
that's fair.
you know.
That's fair.
That has nothing to do with establishment of religion. Right? Nobody's being taxed, nobody's saying.
You can argue that a lot of ways. I'm not gonna weigh into that right now in this forum. What else, friends?
Who kept track of the attendance?
So technically, that is usually a job split between the clergy person and if the church is large enough, a clerk. Of course, notoriously, that was one of the rules that attendance was not particularly like. Yes, you're mandated to attend, but like, are people really going to count you that hard? Like, wait, did I see him this Sunday? I don't know. Right. So it's not, the rules about that are, unless there's times of conflict, are not enforced by and large. It's just not feasible. Now, in like the early days of Elizabeth's reign, where it becomes a political matter, it's a lot more monitored, I guess, for lack of a better word.
You gotta go more into the revolution on the break. It sounds like you might be moving on.
No, I was moving on. I was going to talk a little bit about American denominationalism, but I realized that's way too much to cover today on top of what we've already done.
Can I say a piece?
Sure, please.
What happened to the churches?
Oh yeah, please.
Just because I was architecture historian of that region, the Colonial Virginia region, I came from here and didn't realize the effect of disestablishment they call it on breaking away during the Revolution. What happened? People were so mad at this church that they didn't pay taxes. They tore down the buildings, they trashed them, they went into ruins, all the beautiful churches. Many of them were trashed. And
Oh.
yeah, and again, I learned my history through buildings. It was just tragic to see what happened. But in the 1830s, many were restored, several, but not all of the parish churches. So all over Virginia, there's ruins with
Oh, wow. I knew churches, well, I also knew the flip of that is that churches that weren't necessarily sacked ended up having to sell all their crap so that they didn't close, for lack of a better. So they had resources. So they would sell their candlesticks and their stuff.
There's still strong feelings against the Episcopal/Anglican Church. I ran into groups of like Presbyterianism was founded out on the Eastern Shore of Scotland. Francis McKinney came over from Scotland and he's buried there. And I went to the dedication of his, the park dedicated in his name. And they were bad mouthing Anglicans and English.
Right. I mean, it's anything that's going to be post-colonial, right? There's a very weird tension in a lot of branches of American society between that pushback against previous oversight. You can't tell us what to do. Flip. But that's where culture is. So there's, Anglophilia, like, oh, that's so good, that's amazing. It's an interesting tension because it's both. And sometimes they're simultaneous.
Meanwhile, about a mile away is this huge complex of buildings barely hanging on, but it's the almshouse where the poor and the neglected and homeless live. And the church put them up there and it still exists. So it's
That's cool. That's really cool. Thank you. I did not know a lot of that. So that's totally fascinating. Of course, I've never spent much time in Virginia outside of at VTS. So
I didn't know that part of history when I got there. I was like, oh, really?
that's interesting. Actually, I'm going to go look and I am going to look at both my notes and then the books that I have had and see if it talks more about that because I guess I was sort of aware that I obviously knew about there being tension, but I didn't think about actual church buildings being destroyed, which is, I wonder if that's part of the bigger narrative. Abandoned. And there is a lot of that just because there isn't the clergy and or finances to keep things open and running.
When was the National Cathedral built?
Not that long ago, I want to say it started in 1950. It's post World War II.
Really?
Yeah. So the cathedral system for the Episcopal Church is a late invention. Our cathedral of the Advent was a church for forever and wasn't a cathedral. Actually, you can tell me that. What is it? When did it become a cathedral, Camille? The 70s? Early 80s?
I think about 74.
Okay, so it is, yeah. So it's part of that later movement.
It's a little later because my dad was the rector of the church.
Right.
Because it wasn't a cathedral. When it became a cathedral, it's a dean.
Yes, right. So, and the cathedral system for us, in England, is a whole other thing. And for us, it's a very late in the game
We
idea.
didn't have a cathedral in this diocese, kind of like Virginia still has no cathedrals.
And won't. They don't want one. They're very anti-cathedral, which is just an interesting thing to consider.
Mm-hmm.
Other than that's, the National Cathedral. But
Have presidential religious services always been held at the Episcopal Church in Washington?
Many of them have, and that's why St. John's on the Square is a thing, right across from the White House. There may be some periods where that didn't happen. I don't know for sure. That's not something I've tracked.
Churches. They attend different churches.
Right, but formal functions now tend to happen at the National Cathedral, whatever the denomination of the current president is. So part of the movement of building the National Cathedral, I don't want to spend forever on this, was trying to make the Episcopal Church back into a national institution, to make it a church that served everybody and built into the post-World War II vision of America and of us trying to become a unified, happy place to be, right? The success of we have survived this awful global conflict and now we're successful and what are we going to do with that? Obviously, that vision never went very far, but that was a brainchild and part of the impetus for the National Cathedral was trying to make it, not that you wouldn't still have religious liberty, but that it would become a national church. I mean, I can see some pros to that. I can also see a lot of cons. So I imagine that's why it didn't happen. Right, exactly. Anything else? I know this is sort of popcorny, and this is not quite where I was hoping today would go, but that's just kind of what happened. I think next time we will talk a little bit about the Great Awakening and the proliferation of denominations in the States, which is very different than most other countries. While other churches now will exist in places initially post-Reformation, and once things settled, most European countries basically have two churches. You have we think of as Roman Catholicism, and then whatever Reformed church evolved in that country. So in Germany, it's Lutheranism. In Switzerland, it's literally the Reformed church that was what Zwingli started, and so on. So, but because of our disassociation with those old institutions, as well as being a melting pot, people got a little more interested in doing their own thing. So that's part of the picture of our national story, which it's just interesting because it wouldn't have happened anywhere else, I don't think, in the way that it did here. All right, friends, thank you so much. You'll have a great rest of your Sunday.
Thank you.
You're welcome.